so excited to be out here today. It's so cool. We don't get to come out to the wild, wild west very often. And my husband and I decided that we would make this trip together because we want to go see Estes. And we've been telling everybody at our farmers market for the last couple months that we're coming out to this. And it turns out some of our new customers were actually from Fort Collins. And we told them, oh, we're coming out there, we're going out there. And they said, oh, what weekend are you going? And we told them, and they said, oh, well, do you have your hotel reservations? And Bob says, well, yeah. And they said, oh, that's good, because it's elk mating season. And Bob is thinking, you must have the classiest elk around. So he's impressed. But anyhow, as you just heard, my name is Shannon Hayes, and I write and farm. And, you know, whenever I'm supposed to come to events like this, I'm supposed to tell you like a 2-line biography that gets printed up in your program, who I am and what I do. The truth of the matter is I don't do any one particular thing. My mother would say I don't do anything, but I don't do any one particular thing. So I'm going to give you some background. Bob says when I come up to the events like this, I have a tendency to be a bit strident. So maybe if you understand more about my background, you'll be able to forgive some of my brashness. I work with my family on Sapbush Hollow Farm in upstate New York. And it's very, very hilly up there. We're located in the frosty hilllands, and the farm has been known to see frost 11 months out of the year. And our farm fields are on these very, very steep pitched hillsides. So one of the few ways that we can make a viable living off of that land is through grass-fed meat production. And as a result, meat has come to form this centerpiece in my life. We do a lot of our own processing on the farm. So one of the things that I'm responsible for is overseeing cut fabrication and meat inventory. And then Bob and I take our meats to the farmer's market every week, and we get to see Americans walking by every week staring at us, these meat people, and develop these evolving and changing ideas about what local food means to them in this new world that we're facing. And so as you can probably imagine, it makes me a bit of a social critic. But it also makes us really hardcore optimists, as you'll see. In addition to that, I hold a PhD from Cornell University where I studied sustainable agriculture and community development. And so now what I do is I write and I research about sustainability in our culture. And in addition to that, I write cookbooks about meat, of course. And Bob and I are hardcore locavores. And we homeschool our 2 daughters. Saoirse is age 8 and Ula is age 4. So if you can think about this background a little bit, you might be starting to get an idea that if I'm homeschooling 2 kids, they're getting some real interesting lessons by this point. And boy, that really came true last winter. You see, I was working on my my 3rd cookbook, which is called Long Way on a Little, an Earth Lover's Companion for Enjoying Meat, Pinching Pennies, and Living Deliciously. And the objective of that book is to explain how responsible meat production can be part of a sustainable food system, and how responsible meat consumption need not be a violation of ecological principles, nor does it need to be cost prohibitive. But in order to do that, Americans need to become proficient at working with leftovers. The amount of waste that gets thrown out of our refrigerators is appalling, right? So we need to learn how to work with leftovers. And the other thing we need to learn how to do is to work with the 20 to 30% of every animal that I see coming through our cutting room that goes to waste. Because Americans don't want to do anything with the bones, with the fat, with the skin, or with the organ meats. So that means, of course, that in order to write this book, I myself had to become proficient at working with leftovers and at working with the bones, the fat, the skin, and the organ meats. So last winter, I was writing all these recipes, and I was writing recipe for the heads and for the ears and for the feet and for kidneys and livers. And then came the day when I had to write about cooking with the heart. I'm curious, how many of you are homeschoolers? Anybody homeschools here? Wow, okay. Well, for those of you who don't know, when one homeschool family meets another homeschool family, the one thing that we always want to know about is what kind of homeschooler are you? And there are many different flavors of homeschooling, particularly in the Northeast. And in the Northeast, the flavors are you a Christian homeschooler? Are you an unschooler, a radical unschooler? Are you a Montessori schooler, a Waldorf schooler? Are you an eclectic homeschooler? And everybody tries to figure out who's who. So if anyone out there is wondering what kind of homeschooler I am, the best answer I have is that Bob and I are opportunistic and omnivorous. My case for that, in my example, is that there last winter on my kitchen counter was a big old beef heart. Now, if you think about that beef heart, Saoirse and Ula work all summer long with their grandfather. He's called Pop Pop. They work with Pop Pop. They go out to the pastures. They check on the cattle. They check on the minerals. They check the water. They help him open the gate so they can go to new fresh pasture. And then they saw the cattle get loaded up on the truck to go away for processing. They saw it come back as carcasses. Then they were with me in the cutting room on the day that I took that heart, wrapped it up, and put it in the freezer. So there was that heart on the kitchen counter. Well, Bob and I decided that we would do a 2-day lesson on the heart. So on day 1, Bob sliced the heart open so they could look at it, and he showed them the atrium, the ventricles, and the valves, and how the heart pumps blood throughout the body. On day 2, I took over. What can you think I would talk about? We talked about eating the heart. So we explained about how you don't want any part of the animal to go to waste, and how the heart is a concentrated source of the fat-soluble vitamins which enable our bodies to uptake other minerals and nutrients, so it keeps us healthy. And we talked about how since the heart is working all the time in the animal, there's a lot of connective tissue. And that connective tissue means that it could be kind of chewy if you don't cook it right. So in order to break down connective tissue, here's a little cooking tip in case you needed one before you went home. In order to break down connective tissue, you need to cook it with liquid. So the girls and I decided to make a hearty beef stew. Haha. They loved it. I don't know how many of you can get your kids to eat heart meat, but my kids wanted second helpings, and they wanted me to serve it again for dinner that night. More than that, they wanted me, every time we cut up an animal, they wanted to know where the heart was, and they wanted me to cook it. They wanted me to serve heart to their play dates. Now, I don't know if you guys have the reputation about homeschooling and homeschoolers out here that we have, but back east, homeschoolers are considered a little weird, and those of us who are homeschooling parents kind of go along with that, and we let it be that way. But, I mean, my kids' friends come from pretty conventional backgrounds, and they are going to lose their play dates. If I let them have heart meat on the table, I had to draw the line somewhere. But other than that, I was quite pleased to see my children take such an interest in a very healthful and nourishing food. At the same time that all this heart fury was going on, my family was going through a very sad and beautiful time. My grandfather, Saoirse and Ula's great-grandfather, who's called Great Pop Pop, was dying. And I say it was a very beautiful time because my father, my aunt, and my uncle decided that he would be permitted to die in the peace, dignity, and comfort of his home, surrounded by his family. And so we took on the work of doing that, and Saoirse and Ula became very involved in his passage. You'll find out I don't hide much from my kids, and they were very involved. They would come with me to sit with him. In his final hours, we were all together, holding his hand, crying, listening to him call out to his wife who had predeceased him. And they were very aware when he finally passed. I don't know how many of you have ever lost loved ones before, but if you have, you know that the minute that passage takes place, chaos breaks loose. There's all this paperwork to do. I mean, they're dead. Why is there paperwork? But there's paperwork that has to be done, and then you have to make all these phone calls, and these relatives and friends are flying in from all over the country, and it gets very busy. And if you're a mom and you live on a farm, you're going through their drawers, and you're trying to find tights that don't have, grass stains and holes in them, and dresses that hadn't been worn in with the chickens, and shoes that you could still brush the manure out of and get them presentable for the funeral. And I wasn't paying attention to the fact that Ula, my 4-year-old, was growing increasingly introspective. And she's thinking. I wasn't paying attention. I was busy. My mom and my aunt and I were each in our respective kitchens, and we were getting ready we were cooking all the food that you have to have for after the funeral. So I'm in my kitchen, and there I am, spooning filling into hard-cooked eggs to make my famous deviled eggs. And finally, Ula tries to get my attention. She climbs up onto the kitchen stool. Mommy? Yeah. Mommy? Mommy? Ula engages in recreational questioning. I'm sure you have 4-year-olds who do that. Mommy? 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 Over and over again. So when you're really stressed, it can fray on the nerves. So finally, what? What? Mommy, what will we do at the funeral? Oh, that's an easy question. A funeral is where we're going to say goodbye to Great Pop Pop. Mommy? What? Meanwhile, spooning my egg filling. Mommy, are we going to cut up Great Pop Pop and eat his heart? Egg filling spilled down my wrist as I gaped at my daughter and noticed she suddenly bore a startling resemblance to Jeffrey Dahmer. I wish I could say I had an insightful response, something intuitive, something magical and understanding. I squawked like a chicken. And then I realized, what do we do with anything that dies on the farm? We make good use of it. We cut it up. Saoirse and Ula eat the heart. For those of you who might be worried that the memory of my grandfather has been violated, I want you to know that that man came through the Great Depression. He was 92 years old when he passed. He was extremely resourceful. And I know he was grinning from ear to ear in the next realm at the connections that his great-granddaughter was making. But I remember that I'm going to have to do a homeschooling lesson on cannibalism one of these days. Anyhow, unconventional homeschooling methodology aside, this background of writing and farming and cooking has carved out a bit of a niche for me at these sustainability gatherings. Because you see, farmers and producers have been coming to events like this for quite some time now. Seeking a pathway around the ecological and spiritual dead end that is so often proffered by industrial agriculture, producers have been seeking ways. They come to conferences like this to learn about sustainable practices, to learn about on-farm composting and organic pest management and biodynamic production methods and holistic grazing systems. Rather than blindly following industrial agriculture's mandates to apply pesticides for pests or herbicides for weeds, these producers were seeking to employ their minds in service to their ecosystem and to discover the solutions that Mother Nature could offer us if only we could learn how to farm in harmony with her. So if I gazed out at an event like this, you'd see a lot of big, tall cowboy hats and farm caps and big belt buckles and steel-toed boots. It was sort of, the standard uniform for that kind of a setting. But then the farmers' grassroots networks started to expand. And as their grassroots network started to expand, the audience started to look different. We began to see Mennonites and Amish, and then you had the cowboys and old dairy farmers, and then we had these hippies with nose rings and hipsters with dreadlocks, and they were all coming together under this banner, producer, seeking ways to grow wholesome food for their communities. Well, it took event planners a little while to get used to this, but no sooner had they done that than the audience profile changed again. And that's when I started getting phone calls. I started getting phone calls because there were all these mothers in the audience. Babies strapped to their fronts and tied to their backs. And if that wasn't bad enough, there were these journalists and then foodies and citizen activists and homesteaders and homeschoolers. All of them were coming to these producer gatherings, and nobody knew what they wanted. So event organizers got together and they said, well, what are these people about? Why are they here? What do they all have in common? And they said, well, everybody eats. And in Shannon Hayes' family, they don't just grow the hearts, they eat them. So maybe she could have something to say. So I would get these phone calls, and they say, hey, yeah, Shannon, we have this gathering going on. It used to be a producer gathering, but now it's producers and consumers. Producers and consumers. Producers and consumers. I gotta tell you, nobody liked that expression. To suggest that anyone who doesn't own a farm or a ranch is just a consumer is kind of pejorative. But So, some people tried to get PC about it, and they said, well, it's not producers and consumers, it's producers and citizens. Well, that kind of insults the producers because it suggests that maybe we're not citizens. So, for the sake of being brash and a little bit insulting, I'm going to use that expression, producers and consumers, today. And the reason why I'm going to use it is because there's very important history behind it. And if we can understand that history, then I think we're going to see our way into the future far more clearly. You see, the expression producers and consumers didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. They didn't become separate people until the Industrial Revolution hit the shores of this country. And then, even when they did, producers and consumers coexisted quite peacefully for a good 150 years because, with the exception of the refrigerated rail cars that were transporting some meats and things across the country, most food was grown and produced regionally. But all that changed 60 years ago. 60 years ago is when we had the agricultural industrial revolution, also ironically dubbed the Green Revolution. And this happened as a result of World War II. We had all these companies that got into business with chemicals to help us win the war, and, well, we had to figure out how to keep them in business, so someone had the great idea, I know, let's dump it on the food. So that's what we set about doing. The objective of the Green Revolution was to get farmers to rapidly industrialize. Now, they had some benefits from the Industrial Revolution before, some farm implements and things, but to get them to really get efficient and to get so efficient that we could grow enough food to feed the world. Well, what that did was it took all those little small farms that were feeding their communities and put them out of business. And then farming, to stay in business, you had to borrow a lot of debt because there are a lot of very expensive, highly capital-intensive, specific machinery that you had to own. And it started polluting more. The land that people had for farming started getting farther away from people, and the tracts got bigger and bigger. They were applying petrochemicals. The animals were being confined, and it became nasty work. And so our culture started to subdivide. And you started to have the producers over here, less than 2% of the population, and the consumers over here, 98% of the population. It was far more pleasant to go get a paycheck and then buy what you need than it was to engage in that lifestyle over here that was becoming increasingly polluting and was falling under the furrowed brow of some of the public. I want to stop for a minute, and I want to talk to you about what industrialization is about. The goal of industrialization is efficiency. And so, in the name of efficiency, industrialization takes human beings and it divides them into mind workers and body workers. So, if you can picture a pyramid here, at the very top of the pyramid, you have the mind workers. They call all the shots and they make all the decisions and they also make the money. And then at the bottom in industrialization, you have the body workers. And what they were supposed to do was not think. They were supposed to be just a cog in the wheel, and they were supposed to do their job and be grateful for their wages, and they're not supposed to employ their intellect. They're only supposed to use their bodies. They're not supposed to employ their creativity or their sense of craft. Now, farming was a holdout vocation. Industrialization started doing this to other people for a while, but farming held out because we didn't industrialize till about 150 years later. So farming was one of these last vocations where the mind and the body had to work together in order to generate a livelihood. But everyone else had kind of been subjected to this earlier on. And I got to tell you, it wasn't a real popular experiment at first. Americans were by and large pretty self-reliant, and they were only interested in so many industrially produced goods. So in order to make more money, the factory owners had to figure out, the problem here is Americans are satisfying their needs, but we can't make enough money on needs. Americans need to have wants. Enter advertising. Enter consumerism. Okay, so let's talk about what consumerism looked like and how it played out in the American household. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the household was the sphere of men and women working together. That's right. It was the sphere of men and women working together. Think back to the heroes of the American Revolutionary War. The soldiers, the lawyers, the thinkers, the politicians. None of them were just soldiers and lawyers and thinkers and politicians. All of them produced something else in some other way. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie about John Adams' life, but in the opening scene, John Adams is with his son out in the barnyard, and he's holding a big steamer from his cattle in his hand. And he's waxing poetic about cow dung and how it's so vital to building soil fertility. John Adams wasn't just a lawyer, he was a farmer, as were many of the soldiers who fought the war. Ben Franklin was an inventor, Paul Revere was a silversmith. Everybody produced in some way. And when it came to the household, that was the center. That was the center of production, and men and women shared that responsibility together. But then the Industrial Revolution happened, and we started seeing these factories pop up, and the men were the first to go away to work, to get the wages, to pay for the goods and services that they used to provide at home. I keep kicking that bottle. So the women were left at home. And that is when America decided it had this age-old idea, which isn't old at all, that the sphere of man is in the workplace and the sphere of woman is in the home. She was left at home with a lot of back-breaking work. And I can't knock the Industrial Revolution entirely because they really did come up with some pretty helpful solutions. To this day, I remain thankful for my automatic washing machine and my stove, for example. Actually, Bob does all the laundry, so he remains thankful for the automatic washing machine, and I remain thankful for the stove and for Bob. That's about right. But in order to drive this economy forward, we needed Americans to take interest in more than just a few durable consumer goods. We needed Americans to let go of what they knew. We needed Americans to outsource their self-reliance. So what happened? Well, you no longer needed to weave cloth. You could buy it. You no longer needed to sew your own clothes. You could buy them. You didn't need to mend them, throw them out, buy new, update, upgrade, stop, throw out your home remedies to take care of your family. Allow sound science to help you take care of your children and your loved ones. And by all means, stop making your own cleaning solutions because allow the proven chemicals that are bestowed upon us by modern technology to help you to protect your family from germs. And by all means, people, by all means, the one thing you want to do is never engage in that outrageously dangerous act of putting up your summer harvest from your garden. Allow the food scientists working in the safety of our laboratories and in our pristine, clean factory conditions to put up the harvest for you, to process the food for you, so that you won't poison your family to death. Well, the American economy grew. But in order for that vision to come true for everyone, we all needed to forget. Nobody knew anymore how to sew, how to tend a garden, how to feed pigs or chickens or livestock, because there was always going to be somebody, somewhere, who could do it for us cheaper and more efficiently. And if they could do it for us more efficiently, well, then all we needed to do is keep collecting that paycheck. So, hang on, I got some notes coming out here. All we needed to do is to keep collecting that paycheck. But as I mentioned earlier, that Industrial Revolution divided up the men and the women. So the men were in the factories, the women were in the home. So this consumerist experiment was played out on the women. The women were the lab rats for this. We were the ones that were supposed to start with all this purchasing, and we were the ones who were actually controlling how the family spent money, and our craft tradition of homemaking was being outsourced. And it didn't go well. It didn't go well at all. And in 1963, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. And in it, she documented what the medical field had been witnessing for quite some time now, Housewife Syndrome. Housewife Syndrome was where these women who were now stuck in their suburban homes and all they did was sort of drive and buy were discovering that life wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and they were suffering from nervous breakdowns, emotional disorders, and chronic depression. Well, as a result of Friedan's work, women went out into the workforce in droves. The idea was that by generating a second income, the balance of power would be equalized in the household, and women would gain new self-esteem for contributing to society in a more valuable way. Some of that really did come true. There were side effects. For one thing, we drove up the cost of living. The next thing that we did was we gave America a workforce willing to do with the same job at a fraction of the pay. And we started getting fat. First men left the home, then women left the home. Now we had all these empty homes that were supposed to be used in order to feed ourselves, and no one was home doing that. What a great money-making opportunity for corporate America. Let's cook the food for them. The trouble is, when someone was in the home, someone was looking out for the nutritional welfare of the family. But when corporate America took it over, they didn't care about nutrition. They cared about the bottom line. Thank you. So, what happened was we started becoming fat. In 1967, just a couple years after the Feminine Mystique came out, just a couple years afterwards, per capita consumption of high fructose corn syrup was 0.03 pounds per person. By 2006, it was over 50 pounds per person. At this point today, in this country, we are in an obesity epidemic. 66% of Americans are overweight or obese. That's the adult. 1/3 of our children are. So, to oversimplify a bit, in the past, every man, woman, and child bore responsibility for producing for our welfare in some way, whether they produced shelter, clothing, food, healthcare, education, or entertainment. We were all responsible in some way. I mean, think about entertainment. That's a great one with kids. Kids don't have to produce entertainment anymore. If you think about how kids played, 100 years ago, they went outside, they had a stick, they had their imagination. In mainstream America right now, entertainment, they went out and they produced their entertainment with their imaginations. But in mainstream America now, entertainment is purchased. It's on a little flat screen that they can carry around in the backpacks, or it gets mounted up on the walls. And it's purchased from a multimedia corporation, and it's a passive activity. But back then, it was also something that was produced. So everybody had to produce for their well-being. And it was critical to our success as a young nation. Think back again to the American Revolutionary War. Why were we able to declare our independence from England? Oh, I know, I learned this in school, right? We were able to declare our independence from England because a band of motley soldiers came together under the brave leadership of General George Washington and fought off the British. That's part of the story. We were able to declare independence from England because we had the ability to be independent. When the colonists first came to the shores of this country, they were completely reliant on the goods that came over on the British merchant ships. But over time, they developed skills. They learned to work with the local foods. They learned the skills that they required in order to survive. Craftsmen set up shop. We had trade and commerce between each other. We didn't need to be buying the British crap anymore. The fact is, there was some of it that we wanted, but we didn't need it. And when you don't need it, that's when you can start to declare independence. And back following America's Revolutionary War, we understood this. We understood this so keenly that following the Declaration of Independence and following our final acknowledgement from old King George, we made the household supreme. America entered what became known as the golden age of domesticity. And in that era, we realized that the power and the productivity of that household was going to be instrumental in our viability as a young nation. And so what started happening? First of all, we understood the household, that was where you learned democratic ideals. That was where it started, in the family home. And so we started seeing things like the first wave of feminism that came through the country, which resulted in some pretty significant achievements like, abolition and suffrage, nothing minor. And then by 1860, men and women had equivalent literacy rates, girls had as much access to education as boys, and family size was growing smaller. I just got to think about where I was here. I'm falling apart here, guys. I'm falling apart here. Okay, so not only was family size growing smaller, but women were becoming more influential. Think about Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin and became, in Abraham Lincoln's words, the little woman who made this big war. The golden age of domesticity was the last era in this country when the mind and the body were working as one. There was money to be made in severing the mind from the body. There was money to be made in convincing people in the power of efficiency and economies of scale and to let things happen elsewhere. And there is money to be made to this day in convincing Americans that we are completely helpless when it comes to taking care of ourselves. That if we can't get this paycheck, what do we hear all the time? What are we harping about in the news? Oh, it's the jobs, Mr. President. It's the jobs, Mr. President. We need paychecks. We need paychecks. Because we are so completely powerless as a culture to take care of ourselves. I'm not suggesting that we don't need money. We've had coins since the ancient Sumerians came up with them. Money's not going away. But when you have skills, you have the ability to take care of yourself using your mind and your body working together, then money becomes a small part of your well-being portfolio because the rest of your well-being portfolio is coming from the things you know how to do and the relationships that you have, and you can live on significantly less money. So, the money is in convincing us that we're helpless. The money is in convincing us that the only way to survive is to be a consumer. And that, my friends, is why we have the expression producers and consumers. It's more efficient. Can you hear me over the train? Okay. So it's more efficient. It's so efficient now, it's frightening. Think about our food supply. The Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 70% of our plant genetic diversity has been lost, 30% of our animal livestock species are on the verge of extinction, 75% of our human food supply in this world is coming from 12 plants and 5 animal species. And 6 companies are controlling 98% of our seed supply. That leaves us highly vulnerable to disease, to famine, and to political whim. What is equally frightening is that 3 generations of Americans have now walked this earth without a clue about how to plant a garden, what foods are in season when, what chickens and pigs and cows and sheep eat. Find out where I am again here. I think the worst part of this, though, is that because we're so powerless, we're willing to overlook the atrocities that are being committed. We like to accuse people who aren't at sustainable living fairs of being not caring. They don't care, they don't think about it, they only think about themselves. Well, it's not exactly that way. It's that they don't have the skills to take care of themselves. And so they know to survive, they've got to have that paycheck coming. And if they don't have that paycheck coming, they don't know how they're going to get a roof over their head or food in their bellies. And when they have to just depend on that paycheck, they're going to think of the bottom line when it comes to buying that food. And they don't want to think about the atrocities that are being committed, about the abuses of our soil and our water, about of the humans and the livestock and the rapid fossil fuels that are being consumed. So, to get back to this idea of producers and consumers, what's my point in harping on this concept? My point is that we should all be producers, period. Because when everybody produces, when each of us becomes a producer, we increase our personal self-reliance and our household self-reliance. When our household self-reliance increases, our community self-sufficiency becomes a reality. And when communities are self-sufficient, nobody goes cold and nobody goes hungry. Our agricultural genetic diversity increases and our risk of disease and famine decreases. As that happens, our overall health and well-being improves, our democratic roots grow stronger, and this corporate oligarchy begins to crumble. And the reason it begins to crumble is the same reason why we were able to declare independence in 1776. It crumbles because we don't need them. And that is the most important thing we need to know to unravel what's ruling us today. Okay, so you're being very polite. I like your chat, your little claps and stuff. That's really great. It makes me feel good. I know, out in the audience, there's somebody out there who's looking at me, making eye contact, and they're thinking, she's an idiot. She's crazy. This woman is totally Pollyanna. For one thing, I mean, let's face it, America has the safest food supply in the world, right? I mean, we can't mess with that. I mean, let's not talk about all the ground turkey that was recalled last week and the week before for salmonella poisoning, or, you know, that the FDA had to recall 500 million eggs last year for salmonella poisoning from grocery store supermarket shelves. I mean, 500 million. Do you realize that's enough eggs to feed breakfast to every man, woman, and child in this country? Yeah, that's a safe food supply. Or what about the fact that the CDC now estimates, like they said, between 1999 and 2006, 45% of American adults were suffering from chronic illness. Our food is nourishing us? I mean, 45% of us? And we want to call ourselves a superpower? Some people say we need to be doing this kind of thing, growing food and feeding the world, because they can't take care of themselves and the rest of the world. But think about how many of the world's resources are being sucked up, how much water is being polluted, how much land is being destroyed to produce gewgaws for us, to put in our Christmas stockings, or, you know, to provide the non-necessary foods that we want, exotic fruits, sugar, coffee. If we took responsibility for producing for our own well-being, how many resources would be freed up elsewhere for other people to start producing for their own well-being? Now, there's other people who are going to find this idea horrifying, because what I'm suggesting, when I say the mind and the body need to work together, what I'm suggesting is we need to do a little physical work. And what have we been taught about work? Work is what stupid people do. Work is drudgery. Everybody worked hard to get off the farm. We don't want to go back to that hard existence. Work was where we were unhappy. It's balderdash, people. It's balderdash. If you want to talk about an unhappy culture, look at us right now. We are in a depression epidemic. There is 10 to 20 times as much depression as there was 50 years ago, and it's starting younger. It used to set in at 29 and a half years of age. Now we're starting to see it at 14 to 15 years of age. Right now, the National Institute of Mental Health estimates that 1 out of every 4 Americans is suffering from a diagnosable mental disorder. So think about that. I mean, look 2 people to your left, 2 people to your right, and you decide who's cuckoo. Of course, if they came here, they'd say the ratio is significantly higher, so maybe you want to take that stat with a grain of salt. But anyhow, the final thing that people are going to say is this is just plain old dreaming, because it's not like we're walking around with a couple $100,000 in our back pocket that we can just all go out, slap down on some farm. Oh, we're in the West. You slap down on ranches, not farms. I'm from the East. We have farms. You guys have ranches. You can't just go slap it down on a ranch and then say, hoo-hoo, I'm going to be a happy farmer, and that's going to be the end, or a happy rancher. It doesn't work that way, no. We have to think outside the box. The New York City nonprofit group Sunworks estimates that there are 14,000 acres of unshaded rooftop in the city of New York alone, which, if put into agricultural production, they feel could feed the entire city of New York and generate leftovers. Add to that, there are 40 million acres of lawn in this country. That makes turf grass our largest irrigated crop. Can you imagine how many chickens and turkeys and zucchinis and tomatoes and backyard pigs the lawns could be producing? And that's not the only way that we produce. There are so many ways to produce. You could be taking local materials and crafting them into simple toys for children. Maybe you can take some of the bones that we're generating on Sapbush Hollow Farm and craft them into the things that they used to be used for, like buttons and needles and crochet hooks. Another thing that you could be doing is maybe you know how to make tools or repair equipment, or maybe you have the ability to write or sing or communicate in ways that enable our communities to be independent from multimedia corporations. There are so many ways that we could produce, but what matters is that we produce more than we consume. When we do, our cost of living goes down, our ecological sustainability goes up, our communities become more self-sufficient in these coming times of fossil fuel scarcity and extreme climate vacillations. The best part is that it's fun. And if you're questioning this, hang around in this audience after this talk lets out, because find some of the wacky people like me who are living this way. And I think you're going to find they're having a great time. We're a little bit kooky. We might be the 1 in 4 that the National Institute is talking about. But really, if you talk to them, you're going to find out that they're doing critical work that is contributing to their communities in a powerful way, and that work is spreading and touching the lives of countless others. So, to bring this around, hang on. To bring this back around to Saoirse and Ula and their heart obsession. How many hearts can we grow if we allow our minds and our bodies to work as one? If these hearts that are nourished because they're going to grow stronger and self-confident because they know they can work as a whole human being. Hearts that are going to be made stronger by the bonds that will join human beings in neighborly interdependence and community self-sufficiency. We're facing a time of incredible change right now. Incredible change. I don't know if you heard, I'm from Schoharie County, and I don't think it made the national news, but when Hurricane Irene didn't hit New York, they didn't really talk about where it did hit. It hit my community. And we've been obliterated, and we've seen firsthand what these extreme weather patterns can do. It's frightening. We're facing extreme weather patterns. We're facing dwindling dollar values, dwindling fossil fuel resources, dwindling opportunities for conventional employment. And in the face of all of this, if there's one thing I want to leave you with today, is that it's okay to be hopeful. It is absolutely okay to be hopeful. Because if we can face these things and stare them head on and deal with them, what we're going to notice is all these trappings of this material culture are finally being stripped aside, and we're going to be pushed to become a truly beautiful society. And we stand the chance, as human beings, we are being given the chance to finally become a beneficent species on this planet. And I think that's so exciting. A lot of people come to hear me speak at a point of turmoil in their lives. They're very distressed. They're distressed about fossil fuels and climate change and the economy, and they're experiencing a lot of fear. And I want to tell you that if you can make this change, stop being a consumer and start being a producer, what's going to happen is you're going to plant a seed of hope within your heart. And unlike fossil fuels, hope is a renewable resource. The more you indulge it, the more you feed it through your daily actions, producing more than you consume, the more that hope is going to grow strong, and the more lives that are going to be touched, and the more we'll be able to help all hearts grow. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to be over signing books in that green tent over there in the book tent.